27-year-old Michael Wells wandered off of his grandparents' property after seeing a child sticking his head out of a barn door and beckoning to him from across the street. Curious, Michael entered the barn but only found the burned up and gutted interior that smelled of ashes and singed wood. Suddenly, a hand playfully pushed him from behind as if in a game of tag. Michael turned around to see the young boy but backed away horrified at his charred and skeletal face. As he did, he covered his eyes and yelled for him to go away. When he looked again, the other boy was gone. Michael ran back to his grandparents' house. After listening to his story, his grandmother explained how it must have been his imagination. She did tell him that the barn had burned months before, but omitted one detail from the story: the death of a child around his age. At 10, Michael stayed overnight at a friend's house. In the middle of the night, his friend woke him up at 3 a.m. and dared him to spend 15 minutes in the haunted attic. He agreed due to the boy's continued pestering, but was hesitant in his steps as he climbed the narrow, rickety ladder to the dark opening above. Once there, he stood next to the now enclosed entranceway, keeping his eyes lowered to his bare feet the entire time. After 15 minutes, the noise of scraping fingernails came from the opposite corner, and when he looked up, he saw a silhouette moving within the shadows that stopped and turned as if realizing his presence. The thing now pushed its way through the piles of junk towards him. Michael managed to cry out to it to leave him alone. It then stopped and returned to the other side of the attic. Upon vanishing, the voice shrieked at him, "I died here. I can never leave." He spent the rest of the day cowering next to the trap door until his friend opened it and he quickly exited, almost falling off the ladder in his haste. For the rest of the night he remained silent, his friend unable to coax any information out of him. Later, due to his continued agitation, his parents came to take him home. Once home, they reassured him that it had been a peculiar family trait to sometimes hallucinate or overimagine things. What it amounted to had been a harmless psychological affliction that he could avert by simply closing his eyes and counting to 10. Though he had seen many bizarre and unexplained incidents throughout his teens, the third major encounter happened in college. He, a psychology major, spent an afternoon on the third floor stacks in a gloomy section of the university library. In the middle of the fourth row of shelves, while reaching for a book, a hand grasped his shoulder, making him glance to his side. He found himself face to face with an old woman with gray clouded over eyes, mouthing silent words to him as if unable to communicate her message. Michael jumped back and dropped his book in terror. She had vanished at the sound of the book hitting the carpet. The next day, upon reading a school paper, he came across the obituary and a photo of this librarian who had died earlier in the week. He merely shrugged off the incident, believing the sighting to be the combination of having somehow seen the librarian's face before, combined with a hallucination due both to a lack of sleep and an odd moment of disorientation. During his senior year of college, feeling a little inebriated after a late-night party, he left his car behind and walked a mile back to his apartment. Passing a cemetery not too far off campus, he watched the headstones shine due to the occasional passing set of headlights. Nearing the front gate, his eyes caught a silhouette standing near a grave some 40 feet away. Believing it to be an oddly placed statue, it having remained still during the minute he stared at it, he saw it move, making its way towards where he currently stood. Half drunk and on wobbly feet, a chill seized him and he began to run as fast as he could back to his apartment. When he arrived there, he then remembered that he had heard it speak. "Please talk to me if you can see me." He later laughed when relating this story, believing he had been frightened by some drunken vagrant lost in the graveyard. A couple of years later, while attending grad school, he met a young woman named Denise and subsequently fell in love. He had dated before, but never with the rush of excitement and expectation whenever being around her. They held one another on the cold nights, and upon feeling her head upon his chest, he knew she had been right for him. After a year of dating, he proposed to her, and she accepted. At times, Denise seemed fragile and vulnerable, as if easily spooked, but that made him want to marry her more, to be her emotional support. He was even charmed when she told him that the night before the wedding, her late grandmother came to her in her dreams and gave them her blessing. "That's nice," he said, "but you know that it's just a dream." "Yes," she said, I know a dream is a dream. You don't have to be so condescending, you know. Just as educated as you are, remember that. I'm not Okay then, thank your grandmother for the nice blessing. Hell, why don't you take a nap and do it right now? He said, withholding a snicker. Alright, smartass, she said, laughing, then embracing and kissing him. She looked him in the eyes. More things in heaven and earth. Okay, but still, I don't want you to be one of those kooks that has an overactive imagination and can't tell the difference between fantasy and reality. She nodded, but appeared a little offended. At his wedding reception, when he and his new bride entered the limo, he turned around to wave to all the well-wishers. As he did, he spotted a man standing in front of a portion of the crowd. The man, who had been dressed in t-shirt and jeans, did not appear to move at all, only stared in a way that made him stick out all the more from the other wedding guests. He looked only briefly at the man until his wife pulled him into the limousine, kissing him passionately with tears streaming down her eyes. Looking outside again before the limo drove off, he could no longer find the strange man. Much later, he remembered the motionless figure in front of the crowd. The more he reflected on it, the more he realized that man had been missing an ear. Months later, he would look through one of his wife's family albums and recognize that same man in one of the older photos. When he asked Denise about him, she told Michael that had been her father. He had killed himself when she was only 7. She told him, on the verge of tears, that she had been the one who had found him. He listened to her describe the blood that covered the bathroom floor and then to her vivid description of the hole where his left ear had been. Afterwards, he shrugged it off as an hallucination, believing that his wife must have shown him a photo of her father and he had forgotten about it. In a period of 5 years, they had 2 children together. He worked while she stayed home taking care of them. As the years went on, his wife's behavior became odder and even more erratic. One day, while washing dishes, she claimed to have seen a man staring at her in the backyard from the kitchen window. Her husband calmed her down and, once reassuring her, went outside. He searched the entire fenced-in backyard, scanning over any possible hiding place, ready to scare off the trespasser. He found no one. Upon returning to the back door of the house, he suddenly turned around to see a man standing in the middle of the backyard. "I love to watch them," the man told him in a monotonous voice seemingly detached from his body. The image of his kids playing in the backyard popped into Michael's head, and he lunged at the man. Astonishingly, he vanished before Michael could grasp him. He only heard a disembodied voice say, "I want your family." After he returned to the kitchen, Denise asked him if he had seen the same man she had. He told her yes, but then explained that what he had seen must have been a mass hallucination triggered by the power of her suggestion. "We have the same condition, but how do you know it isn't real?" she asked. "Maybe we can see an extrasensory world that others cannot." "It just can't be. There's more to this world than—" "Listen to me," he said, grabbing her shoulders. "We hallucinated this man in the backyard. What we experienced was psychological and nothing else." She nodded, and that was that. Late one night, Michael woke up to see a silhouette in the corner of his bedroom. He jolted up wide awake without interrupting his wife, who still lay asleep beside him. "I lived here before," the silhouette said, the same voice he had heard from the backyard a week earlier. "Your family will be mine." Mortified, he turned on the bedside lamp, nearly knocking it over, but only discovered an empty room. His frantic behavior had awakened his alarmed wife, who now sat up breathless next to him. "What's going on?" Denise asked, bewildered and groggy. "I'm sorry," he replied, trying his best to hide his uneasiness. "Bad dream." Michael put a reassuring hand on Denise's shoulder before getting up to go to the bathroom across the hall, closing the door behind him. About to enter the bathroom, he heard a voice. "You both can see me, and yet you cannot stop me from doing whatever I please." He listened, yet remained motionless, knowing that what he heard had not been there. He thought back to what his parents had told him about seeing things being his unfortunate inheritance. Had this resulted from a sleep paralysis due to a recent increase in stress? Days later, he ate dinner at home by himself while his wife and kids spent the day at her mother's. He expected them home by 7. By 8 o'clock, he wondered what could be keeping them. At 9, he called his mother-in-law, hoping that they had yet to leave her home. When she told him they had left at 6, he worried. After an hour of nervous phone calls, he received a visit from police. In complete solemnity, an officer looked him in the eye and told him that his family and 2 children were dead. His wife had erratically swerved off the road into a nearby tree in the middle of a forest. Denise then left the children in the car to get help, but had froze to death only 10 feet from the car. An officer found the 2 children frozen in the back seat. The police had found her unused cell phone in her hand and believed, judging by her position, that she must have had some kind of mental breakdown. In shock, Michael pieced together all the warning signs of her recent unstable behavior that he had shrugged off and had tried to make himself believe as unimportant. He spent the following weeks with consoling family and friends. A news reporter interviewed him in a short segment that would precede the weather. He knew they sought an angle, a sob story, but also a morality tale about a now penitent husband, a successful psychiatrist, in fact, who ironically missed the warning signs of some undiagnosed schizophrenia. They needed this kind of narrative for their own rationalization of this tragedy, yet he too wondered if maybe they were right about him. He now spent his nights remembering about her fears of seeing that man in the backyard, and now wondered if he should have gotten her some help. Both he and his wife, maybe even their children, shared the same odd neurological makeup with a genetic propensity to hallucinate, but she didn't have the strength to dismiss it as part of her imagination as he did. Or could the spirit world actually communicate with the both of them? His family now dead, his cache of logical explanations no longer consoled him. One night, grief-stricken, he drove to the spot in the forest where his family had died. He found the tree. Piled up against the trunk were bouquets of flowers left by family, friends, and even strangers who commiserated with the news story. Although he had trouble believing that he could see the dead, he held out a hope that maybe he would find them there, at least in the form of apparitions who now existed within the vicinity of the tree. And he did find. The 3, even in death, appeared terror-stricken. They now knelt in supplication before the man he had seen in his backyard months before. Judging by the horrified and desperate looks, they must have somehow been under his control. He called out to them, but they never answered, only focused on the man who stood in front of them. Only the strange man had acknowledged him, turning around and displaying a diabolical grin. Michael realized that this monster most likely had jumped in front of their car, causing Denise to swerve directly into the tree, and must have terrorized her until she died where she did. The more he looked at the man, the angrier he became. Michael couldn't understand how this could be their fate, how they could now be subject to this thing's sadistic enjoyment. They belonged to him, and he controlled their moves and made them do as he wished. Michael attacked the man, but found nothing solid to assail. He could do nothing to stop this or disrupt whatever hold he had upon them. Distraught and emotionally exhausted, he cried despairingly, then dropped to his knees in front of his tormented family. "I failed you," he said, face down, nearly buried in the snow. Then addressing his wife, "I'm sorry I didn't believe you." He shivered but remained there, believing in a short time he would join them. With his body temperature dropping to near dangerous levels, a solid, warm hand grasped his shoulder. Gazing upwards at his wife, he rose to meet her forgiving eyes. His eyes meeting hers, he understood all. The 2 children joined them, and the 4 embraced. Michael held on, firmly grasping what couldn't be real, yet believing otherwise, as if all along this had been the only reality. This brief moment ended when she and the children vanished. "Where did they go?" An astonished voice called out to him. "They've gone," he told the murderer without looking at him. "You'll never see them again." Michael, cold and somewhat hobbled on weak knees, walked back to his car. Brushing off the snow, he stopped and turned just enough to show the ghost his profile while addressing him. "As for you, you'll roam this earth alone forever." Though he did not look his way, Michael could feel the distress and pain that his words had caused the man, as if laying a curse on his head. While sliding into the car, Michael thought up a possible explanation for the entire incident. He could dismiss everything as his mind creating an hallucination and even a delusion for a sense of closure. This time, however, his belief overcame years of skepticism and sober rationality. Regardless of whether it happened or not, he resolved that from now on he'd be a sympathetic ear to everyone who sought him out, living or dead. Driving home, tears still streaming downward, he smiled for the first time in months, overcome with solace and peace, believing that upon his death he and his family would reunite. Listening to a presentation of The Haunted Scribe, a new channel here on YouTube that I created, featuring some of my older stories that I have written, all to promote an ebook I plan on publishing in September. I plan to publish more stories in the coming week, and even portions of my novel, and maybe even expand from there on. I hope you enjoyed this presentation, and I thank you for listening. Peace.